there's quite a good checklist just to be conscious of when you're thinking about, like, you might have like your most beautiful image set up, you're ready to just do the last stage, which is, you know, people, and then like final tweaks, whatever it is. The first thing you think about is like the people that you're choosing. Makes a huge difference to how well or how easy it is to get them to sit into the scene. And that might sound really obvious, but it's amazing how often that is not done, even at like super professional level. And it's really basic things like, what is the atmosphere that you've painted? Like, where is the sun coming from? Is it a bright day? Is it a winter day? Is it a summer's day? You know, like, what is the atmosphere that you've created? Do the people that you're selecting kind of marry up with that atmosphere, time of day, place? Because there's nothing worse than like, oh, look at all these people playing in the park, and there's like a guy in an anorak, you know, with a beanie on, who looks like he's just walked out of like Russia. They just stand out immediately like a sore thumb. So literally clothing is like, you know, a real kind of should be a qualifier for like when you're choosing people for a scene. The sun direction, light direction is a big one, because that's really difficult to change. And when you drop people in a scene and the shadows coming from the wrong side, it can be quite difficult to know what's wrong, but that's what's wrong. So being conscious of that when if you're flipping people, and, you know, where is the shadow on them and where is the sun on them, and how do they sit in your scene, is a really important one to be conscious of. Color is actually a really good thing to keep an eye on, because generally as you're working towards creating an image, there's like a harmony in the colors that you're putting together, and you'll have resolved that to get to the point where you're really happy with the image. And dropping in a bunch of people that have like bright colors that maybe jar with the image can really upset the way that they sit in the image. So just being conscious of that, and that's something that can be adjusted in Photoshop, but you want to be aware that you need to do it if you're going to drop that person in, because they might be like the perfect person, but they're wearing like a bright pink t-shirt. So you just need to like reduce the pink in that person in their t-shirt. I'll go through I'll try and run through quickly how I would go about doing that in a sec. The other thing is contrast on a character, like depending on where they are relative to like the foreground to the background, you want to make sure that they're sitting in the scene, and the best way to do this is actually to check that the black in that person matches up with like the blacks that are naturally in your render at that point in the scene, and they'll be more gray the further back you get, and depending on the scene, sometimes they'll be more blue. And then adding shadows, being conscious that sometimes if you're in a very strong sun environment, like this one's actually probably not a great example, or the other one, because it's quite diffuse light, which is a lot more forgiving, which is also worth bearing in mind, because sometimes that is it's a really lovely light condition to work in, and it's a bit more forgiving in terms of like dropping people in. But if you have, you know, harsh, strong shadows in your scene, then the people will need quite strong contrast and, you know, directional light, and probably a shadow. And depending on where you're sourcing your people from as well, like, you know, there's a lot of great like assets out there where they'll give you the shadow with the person, and they'll even tell you kind of roughly where the sun is, you know. And there's like probably like a 45-degree, you know, tolerance, where like if it's roughly coming from the right direction, you'll be fine, but if it's like the wrong side, it'll just look wrong. I think those are like most of the and then scale is really important to get that right, because it's really easy to get it wrong. And then the easiest way to get it wrong is if your camera, like the view that you've taken of your space, if that's not at eye level, it can be much more difficult to guess or gauge how big somebody should be, you know, depending on where they are in the scene. If you get the camera at eye level, it's a lot easier, because your horizon line and where all of your perspectives kind of merge, which can be, you know, I've literally done it with a piece of paper on my screen before just to check. The horizon line is where you want like the eye level to be of all your characters. So if it's sort of it's certainly easier if you have your camera at eye level perspective, and there's a lot of reasons why you generally want that to be the case anyway, but there's always exceptions to that. Sometimes you just can't capture what you need to at eye level. Eye level images are just always more engaging because it feels like you're in the scene. As soon as you start floating around, you kind of detach that human experience from how you're telling the story. So just another one to be conscious of. Let me
say also, yeah, eye level, but what other camera settings for like exterior perspectives, like depth of field and focal length, like what kind of settings do you normally use?
So yeah, your options are normally like parallel perspective, or sometimes that's called orthogonal, which is where like everything's straight. And it's great for diagrams, but you basically never use that for perspectives because it's not perspective. Then you've got 2-point perspective, and what's the other one this one's called? Parallel perspective. I to be honest, like either of those are fine. The thing that you probably want to be conscious of is just being able to set your field of view, and try and treat it a little bit like you've got a camera and like a normal camera rather than a fisheye lens, because there's a temptation to try and capture like as much as possible in one view, like, and then what happens is you really stretch the stuff that's on the edges and it looks weird. And also, if you're doing that, you're probably better off trying to frame a specific message and then another specific message rather than one image that's trying to capture everything, because when you do that you also kind of lose what the focus is, like what is the story you're trying to tell, because you're trying to tell too many stories. So rule of thumb, and this depends on what your settings are and how you control it, but actually let me just check. I try to never go beyond like a 20mm lens, which is a field of view of so like a 20mm 20mm lens, so that's focal length, is the equivalent of like an 83° or H4° field of view. So you're seeing kind of almost 90 degrees. I think when you go lower than, so in camera millimeters, if you go lower than that, it gets wider. It starts to get a bit sort of stretched out. And then I generally like, I mean, if you go up to like 50, you're getting quite narrow, and they're really powerful for if you're trying to capture a moment. Like actually having those longer lenses is really it's a great way of doing that, which you probably won't need to deal with so much. But I'd say if you try and keep to framing whatever you're doing within an 80° field of view, you're in about the right territory.
Thank you.
Because it's really easy to do in, like, I think in SketchUp was really bad at this as well. You've got like 120° field of view, and it's like, oh great, I can see everything, but not great for kind of storytelling and setting up compositions. I mean, with regards to the people, all the things I've gone through earlier kind of apply specifically. That they're all really relevant. Let me just drag a cutout person into here, and I'll kind of try and show you what I mean.
Sorry, I have to go now, but I just want to say thank you.
No problem. Good luck with the deadline.
Thank you. Yeah, bye.
Bye. Try and choose the right person now. Let's try these two. Okay, so starting point, like she's got a bright red t-shirt on, it's not ideal. Also, I'd probably say the light is coming from the left, so try and flip those so it looks like at least like she's maybe walking alongside the edge of the glass. When I do this, I quite often will pull a ruler down. If I've got any 3D people, it's obviously helpful because then I can sort of see, all right, roughly that's sort of eye level, which means that I need to kind of want them to be just back here, kind of being about there. It's probably about right. And this is where I'd probably start with applying curves and linking it down to them, and probably reducing the intensity of kind of the brightness. Maybe softening the blacks. I can add a mask to their layer where I need to cut her out. So if I just, that's quite handy to know about as well, actually. In the Magic Wand, you have this setting for contiguous, which means that like if that's on, I'll only select like what that part of the red, whereas if I turn it off, any red will get selected across the scene, which is quite handy. So if I grab her, go to my mask and say, yeah, I want that bit to be black. That's another shortcut as well. Shift backspace, it just pulls up the fill command, and then you can choose. I nearly always have this just left on foreground color, and then I can toggle with the X, which to make that black. So then she's kind of chopped out those. This is kind of an interesting one because the light is so diffuse that sometimes what I would do is I'd copy a version of them, and then I'd distort this. So that's Control T to transform, and then I basically stretch them around until I had the shadows kind of where I felt like they needed to be. Which when you've got two people is more difficult because they probably need to be edited separately. But let's just say the sun was doing that. So I kind of get them roughly where I needed them to be. And then this is actually the only time I do this, but I'll do it in here anyway. I'd normally just apply this directly to that layer, but if I just reduce the saturation, and then actually what I do is I quite often go all the way to black, so just darkness, so lightness goes all the way down to the bottom, and then I'll add another one that just lifts that a little bit, so it's not so they basically there's like a gray, and then I'll use the blur, Gaussian blur, just to kind of basically soften that. So that might be, depending on how precise you want to be, sometimes I'll do two of these. So one will be for like closer to their feet and one will be for further away, and then I'll blend between the two. But essentially what you're trying to do is just soften the shadow, which is normally more realistic. And then the shadow I would put on a multiply layer so that you're allowing the stuff from below to impact it. And then depending on what I'm trying to achieve. Oh, I still got my leaf. Okay, just back to soft round. I'd use another mask on the to kind of maybe make it stronger at the bottom and soften it. So that's how I do it on like if it was sunnier outside and I needed like a full shadow. In this case, because it's not, I'd probably just paint something in and just put that underneath them. So it's quite helpful actually. When I used to do this a lot more, I'd always like group the people. So in here, I probably just, because it's just see down here. And you can be quite kind of rough initially with it, because then you can just go back and so then I'd soften that with a mask again. Or maybe just like knock it back a bit. And then if I was trying to sort out her color on her t-shirt, I'd either like select specifically. I mean, I'd control click that layer to get both of them. So I guess I could just chop out the bits there. The danger with red is that you end up removing all of the warmth from people's skin, and then they look a bit zombie-like. Wrong way. Forgiveness wrong. Okay, and then adjustment layer, red. Make it a bit more orange, which is closer to the palette in the scene. So then, yeah. Ooh. I think I've just detached that's something to be aware of. If you unlink, like I accidentally kind of unlink that top one, and then it means it's applying that adjustment to the whole scene. So she could do it being a little bit brighter. And actually the blue is quite strong. So those are the steps, basically. And hopefully kind of familiarizing yourself with the masking and the adjustment layers kind of gives you the control that you need to kind of get to the point, but then sort of having an idea of what your checklist is like you're doing yourself a favor, because sometimes there's no amount of Photoshop you can do that will make somebody fit in that scene. The last thing that I do on this sometimes is just create a new layer, just a blank layer, and I'll just with black and white on quite a soft opacity, I'll brush in kind of where I think that the light's coming from, but I'll also do the equivalent on like the shaded side. So something really roughly like that, which then if you put that onto a soft light, it sits into the character and just kind of gives them a slightly more directional light. And depending on how strong you want that to be, you can just fade that again.